It's MLS Cup Saturday between the Seattle Sounders and the Columbus Crew. The Seahawks welcome the Jets, the worst team in the NFL, and the Huskies get COVID. Let's take it around the sound. Hello everyone and welcome back to Around the Sound. Today's Saturday episode is episode 26 of Around the Sound. It's certainly a special occasion. It's certainly a special episode. We get the MLS Cup preview, then we get the MLS Cup tonight on Saturday against the Columbus Crew. The Seattle Sounders traveling to Columbus getting to host that game due to the points per game, collecting more points over the course of the regular season, despite the Sounders being a higher seed. We'll get to all of it. We'll touch on the Seahawks, and we'll also touch on the Huskies having their game this Saturday against Oregon. Highly anticipated matchup canceled due to COVID-19. Before we get into any of that, I want to make sure that all of you are following me on Twitter at the Peyton Thomas and the podcast on Instagram at Around the Sound Seattle. Don't miss a beat. We post on that Instagram account every time a new episode of Around the Sound is released. Of course, there's new episodes of Around the Sound every Wednesday and Friday. You can watch every episode of Around the Sound on YouTube at PTOM Media, that's PTHOM space media, or you can listen to Around the Sound wherever you like to get your podcast. All right, let's hop in. Let's talk about the Sounders. It's the MLS Cup season. It's the fall. It's a little bit later this year than a normal year due to 2020, due to the MLS season being postponed in the spring. For those of you that don't know, I run or co-host an MLS podcast known as the Supporters Pod. We did a full MLS Cup preview and breakdown for both teams over there earlier in the week, so make sure you go and check that out if you haven't already. Columbus has been a very solid team all year. There's a reason that they're in the MLS Cup, and the bracket certainly opened up nicely for them. They were the third seed coming out of the East. They got to host every single playoff game that they've had because Philadelphia, the number one seed in the East, got knocked out in the first round. Toronto, the number two seed in the East, also getting knocked out in the first round by both of those play-in teams, which meant that Columbus was guaranteed home field advantage at least through the Eastern Conference. And then since Sporting Kansas City was knocked out, they were also guaranteed to host the MLS Cup. So a very favorable draw, very favorable results throughout the playoffs for Columbus, who could have only hosted one playoff game in the whole MLS Cup playoffs. But guess that when luck's on your side in 2020, some of those higher teams go down, you get to host those games. The biggest story going into the MLS Cup this year is COVID. Unsurprisingly, 2020, unapologetically, is COVID. And Darlington Nagbe and Pedro Santos have both tested positive or have been deemed high risk. I know Darlington Nagbe has at least tested positive. I don't know if Pedro Santos has as well or if he was part of the contact tracing. But both of these players will not play in MLS Cup. And this is a huge, huge catastrophic blow to the way that the Columbus Crew like to play. The Crew line up in a similar formation to what the Sounders run, with a four in the back. You have two holding defensive midfielders. You have two wingers up top, and then a number 10 that plays that center attacking mid spot, and then a number 9 true striker up front. Pedro Santos is one of those two wingers that's on the outside, and Darlington Nagbe is the Crew's most dynamic midfielder. Easily one of the most dynamic midfielders in the league. The Crew are one of the deepest teams in the league and have viable replacements for both of those players. Caleb Porter and the Columbus Crew, still a very strong team without them, but without especially Darlington Nagbe, this team changes how they move up the pitch. Nagbe is that connecting piece from the ball in the back four, from those four defenders, and getting it up to the playmakers like Lucas Zelrayan and Giassi Zardes up front for the Crew. He was out earlier in the season with an injury, and before he went out, Columbus Crew were on top of the East. They were the last team in MLS to lose. They did not lose a single game until Darlington Nagbe went out. I don't think they've lost more than one game this entire year, the entire 2020 season, when Nagbe was on the field, healthy, and playing for the Crew. For the duration of time that he was out in the middle of the season, the Crew certainly struggled. It was 3 wins, 4 losses, and 2 draws. And they don't really have anybody that they can just slide into that place that will do a job similar to the type of role that Darlington Nagbe likes to play. As far as Pedro Santos goes on the wings, Caleb Porter does have other options on the wings, like Yunus Mukhtar, a player that Columbus used in the MLS's back tournament earlier this year and got some playing time and played quite well for them while Pedro Santos was also out with an injury. But it's Darlington Nagbe that is the main piece. That is the main reason that everybody's talking about for the Sounders to be favorites in this game. Before these COVID cases, before these two players were set to miss this game, these were two pretty even teams. It was difficult to deem a favorite in this match. More people were probably determining the Sounders to be the favorite in this match because of Schmetzer time and because their history in the playoffs. But on paper, these teams lined up very, very evenly until Darlington Nagbe went out. That's not saying that Columbus is still not a dynamic team without him. They're still a very dangerous, solid team without him, but it does certainly change the way that this Columbus team lines up and that they play and match up against the Sounders. Caleb Porter, coach of the Columbus Crew, has won one MLS Cup in his day with the Seattle Sounders' greatest rival to the south, the Portland Timbers. His MLS Cup victory was actually against his current club, now the Columbus Crew, when he coached Portland in 2015, led the Timbers to their now only MLS Cup to this point. And now he joins the Crew after a few years and is looking for another one. And he is a coach that knows the Sounders very well. Of course, when he was with Portland, played the Sounders multiple times a year, always an important match between those two teams. Caleb Porter knocked out the Sounders in the 2013 MLS playoffs. Now he's back. Now he's with Columbus. He knows Brian Schmetzer. He knows how the Sounders team has liked to play in the past. But you're facing a coach on the other side in Brian Schmetzer who has historically been dominant around playoff time. The term was brought up before the comeback against Minnesota, but it has exploded. The term has exploded since the comeback against Minnesota, the 3-2, 3 goals in 19 minutes to win the Western Conference Finals is Schmetzer time. The Sounders always struggle, or usually struggle, in early parts of the season and go through slumps, and then I don't know what happens, but sometime in August or September, they turn it on and just go on this absolute tear, heading into the playoffs. And the Seattle Sounders historically have always been relatively dominant in the playoffs. Going into this game, the Sounders are pretty much fully healthy, except Javier Arriaga, the center back, which isn't that big of an issue. He's awaiting the birth of his first child, apparently in Seattle, according to Brian Schmetzer, so congratulations to him. Shane O'Neill and Yaimar Gomez Andrade will be the two center backs lining up for Seattle, a partnership that has started to develop later in the season. Those two both struggled early on in the year, and the Sounders' main flaw had been on the defensive end between those two center backs' communication, challenges, giving up a lot of penalties, a lot of fouls in and around the box. Now the Sounders have really made that another one of the strengths of their team. Shane O'Neill has made leaps and bounds to become a starter in this league. Yaimar has adjusted his game and adjusted his play to more of an MLS style, or more of the way that the attackers sort of play in the MLS, because it is different than where he played in South America. Now those two center backs will be lining up as a partnership. Even if Javier Arriaga was available for this game, I would expect both Shane O'Neill and Yaimar to start. The Sounders don't want another comeback, and this is one of my keys to the game, is dictating play with more of the possession. With Darlington Nagbe out, the Columbus Crew are more likely to play sort of a cautious counterattacking style, and when you play a more cautious counterattacking style, your defense, your team, tends to set a little bit deeper, drop a little bit deeper, and absorb a little bit more pressure. You allow the opposition to take 60, 65, sometimes 70% of the possession. And then when you get the ball off of after a heavy touch or after a bad pass and an interception, your team breaks and you send your fastest players, your most dynamic players up top on the counterattack to be more deadly. What the Sounders have to do is they have to use that possession. First off, they're going to have to take that possession and sort of dominate the pace of play, which Columbus will partly allow them to do that. But then the more difficult part of that equation is using the possession and dictating play with the possession, not just dilly-dallying around and playing around the halfway line, passing it between your center backs, trying to slowly look for a way forward. Despite Columbus dropping back and willing to absorb some more of that pressure, the Sounders need to find more ways to get Jordan Morris involved, Raul Ruiz-Diaz involved, and Nico Lodeiro involved earlier on in games. In the last two playoff games for the Seattle Sounders, none of those three players had any dangerous opportunities throughout the first half of the Dallas game or the Minnesota game. Columbus is going to drop back, similar to what we saw FC Dallas do a few weeks ago, and similar to the way that Minnesota tried to do in the second half of last week. The Sounders need to find ways, like in that Minnesota game, to break through that shell, those 10 men behind the ball in Columbus, and score so that they can dictate the pace of play. Once you've scored one goal, you force Columbus to sort of break out of their shell because counterattacking isn't most likely going to score them 3-4 goals during the duration of the 90 minutes. They're going to have to start pushing up if the team gets down. If you use that possession effectively, if the Sounders score an early goal and are dictating the pace of play, the Columbus Crew are going to have to push further forward the more that the game goes on, leaving themselves more and more exposed at the back. If the Sounders are still taking that much possession and the Columbus Crew are trying to push up, play a higher line to get the ball back and try to score, come back and fight into that game, that puts the Sounders in a really dominant position, especially when the Crew are missing players up front, one of their wingers in Pedro Santos, and that connector in midfield, that engine room player in Darlington Nagbe. The Crew could look lost. They could look lost in this game if they find themselves down early. If the Sounders score early, if they're able to execute on those keys to the game, this game could be 3-0, 4-0. The more that the Columbus Crew try to push up and the more desperate that they get, the longer the game goes on. This game could be Brian Schmetzer's last. We've talked about the contract negotiations before and around the Sound. Garth Lagerwey, the front office for the Seattle Sounders, the GM, hasn't mentioned and talked too much about how the renewals are going with Brian Schmetzer. To this point, Brian Schmetzer, his contract is supposed to end at the end of this year, and he has not yet signed an extension with the club. A lot of people are speculating why that is. I wonder if the club is starting to phase away from Brian Schmetzer, who's in the older twilight part of his coaching career, and wants to go a different direction with Gonzalo Pineda, who is the assistant coach, the current assistant coach behind Schmetzer, who is in the younger demographic and could coach this team for a really long time. Aside from all the speculation, Schmetzer has, again, not signed an extension to his contract, and right now, unless an extension is signed, this could be his last game as a Seattle Sounders coach, which is very odd to think about. A guy who has been with the Sounders as a player since the 80s, then the head coach in the USL days after the turn of the century, an assistant coach under Siggy Schmidt when the Sounders entered the MLS, and then promoted back to head coach in 2016, and then leading the Sounders to their first MLS Cup. Four out of the five last years in MLS, Schmetzer has led his team to an MLS Cup appearance, including 2020. In the history of MLS, only 3 teams have repeated. DC United had an MLS Cup in 1996 through 1999, won 4 MLS Cups. Houston Dynamo 2006, 2007, and then the LA Galaxy did it in 2011, 2012. The Sounders hoping to do just that. And those 3 teams, when I look at those 3 teams between the early DC United teams, the middle Houston Dynamo teams, and sort of the middle later LA Galaxy teams in terms of how the MLS was performing as a league during those times, you have to start talking about the Sounders as a dynasty. Those are the dynasties in the history of the MLS. DC United early, then the Houston Dynamo, and then the LA Galaxy after them. This Seattle Sounders team is a dynasty, and Jordan Morris was asked about it, and he called it the D word. Apparently, the Sounders in the locker room don't like to talk about that word too much until they can get past this game, until they can win that 3rd star. But you have to start looking at the Seattle Sounders as a dynasty. Yes, DC United won 4 cups, which on paper is statistically more cups. Yes, that LA Galaxy team at the start of this decade was absolutely dominant with European superstars and took the league to new heights that it had not been before in terms of the amount of people watching and the caliber of players that they were bringing onto their squad. But this is a different age of MLS. In the early days of MLS, there were only 8 teams. DC United only had to be better than 7 teams. While there's now 26 teams in the MLS, the Sounders have to be better than all 25 of them. The LA Galaxy, there was also less teams in that era, but the level of competition was also significantly lower. Since 2010, in just these short 10 years, the MLS has gone from sort of a retirement league for European superstars to a league that is taking the best of the crop from Argentina, the best of the crop from Brazil, is bringing in younger and younger European superstars to come in and try to compete in the MLS. And most teams that try to bring in just European superstars like that old LA Galaxy team, those teams aren't finding very much success in the MLS because the level of talent around them is so much higher. When teams go out and splash the cash on 1 or 2 players, soccer's a team sport and they really struggle outside of one or those 1 or 2 European superstars players. It's why we saw the LA Galaxy finish dead last in the Western Conference in 2020 with Chicharito, a player who's played for Real Madrid and Man United, and Pavon, a winger who's played for Boca Juniors in Argentina and been very, very good there. the LA Galaxy don't have very much depth around it because they've spent their wallet, they've spent their pockets on those two European superstars trying to win with the same mentality and the same style that they won the MLS with earlier in the decade, that 2011-2012 dynasty, if you will. This Seattle Sounders team doesn't do it with big European superstars. They are simply winners. They find different ways to win each and every single year, and they're starting to get more publicity for it, and they are one of the big powerhouses in the MLS. But it's time to start talking about this Seattle Sounders team very seriously, especially if they win the 2020 MLS Cup over the Columbus Crew, about how they stack up historically against some of the best that the MLS has seen throughout its days. The level of MLS now is higher than ever before. The amount of success that the Sounders are getting is higher than anyone in the past, except for maybe DC United. But then again, that DC United team, that age of MLS, only started with 8 teams in the league. It's very, very difficult to do what the Sounders are doing right now. Continue to win in a league that is getting so much better each and every year around them, and they're adding more and more teams to the MLS each and every year. The legacy for this team, if the Sounders are able to grab that third star and win the 2020 MLS Cup, it will be talked about in this city for a very, very long time. A very impressive run, especially if it's Brian Schmetzer's last game. We'll have to see how the contract negotiations go as his contract winds down. We'll have to see who's on the touchline for the Seattle Sounders at the start of the 2021 season. It could be a turning point. It could be a last dance, if you will, like the Michael Jordan documentary. We'll have to watch and enjoy and rejoice in the 2020 MLS Cup, and then we'll have to look, sit, and wait and watch what's happening as the team starts to move forward towards the 2021 season. MLS Cup's tonight, 5:30 kickoff Pacific time, 8:30 Eastern time. Should be a great game. I'm really excited. The end of Sounders season, I'm a little bit sad because we won't be able to talk about the Sounders on Around the Sound quite as much or quite as many times until the regular season gets going a few months from now in the early spring. Let's move on to the Seahawks, who should be going through the easiest part of their schedule right now. Before the Giants game last week on Around the Sound, I mentioned you've got the two New York teams at home. You have the Giants followed by the Jets, two franchises that have really struggled in the NFL the last few years. The Jets sitting at 0-12, and last week lost what was sort of a buzzer beater to the Raiders, just in completely Jets fashion. Derek Carr and Henry Ruggs, the rookie receiver out of Alabama, beat them on the final play of a game. Greg Williams, the defensive coordinator for the Jets, fired right after the game for his cover zero play. Derek Carr essentially beat them on what was a Hail Mary on the final offensive snap of the game. Greg Williams ran cover zero, tried to blitz Derek Carr with 6 guys, leaving the secondary completely exposed, leaving a rookie cornerback on Henry Ruggs, a very talented wide receiver. Really a poorly coached, defensively coached game. Classic Jets way to lose. Greg Williams, again, fired right after the game, so they have an interim defensive coordinator, Adam Gase, and a team that is sitting at 0-12. The Seahawks need to focus. Last week, I'll talk about it in a little bit, but the Seahawks might have looked over these New York Jets and have been in kind of cruise control for this part of the schedule where they have the Giants at home, the Jets at home, and then they travel to play Washington. On paper, that should be a very easy part of the schedule for a team like Seattle that has Super Bowl aspirations. Focus is key. When you look over some of those teams like the Giants and you try to be in cruise control for part of this schedule, your quarterback's going to suffer sometimes. Complacency could set in, and you could take some gut punch losses like we saw the Seahawks take last week against the Giants. Shaquille Griffin versus Pete Carroll. And no, these guys are not fighting, but Pete Carroll was asked in the media, did the Seahawks take the Giants lightly? Did they overlook the strength and the talent of the Giants, and that's the reason that they lost the game? He said no. He was asked about it several times. He said no, the guys fought hard, it just wasn't our day, it wasn't our day. And then Shaquille Griffin was asked the same question just a day later, and he said, yeah, I think the team did overlook the Giants. They did take the Giants' offense a little bit lightly. And he said the offense because they were mostly, Shaquille Griffin, of course, a defensive player, talking about the defensive side of the ball. But this goes for both sides of the ball. This is a similar conversation to the one I had on Around the Sound last week about the offensive ineptitude and the identity crisis that Pete Carroll has with his offense. Pete Carroll's almost like this old grandma that is out of touch with all of her grandkids and tries to act like she's cool. Pete Carroll seems completely out of touch with his locker room, with his offensive coordinator, and with his quarterback. I talked about earlier on Around the Sound how Pete Carroll wants to be a running offense. He wants to be a ground and pound, power run first kind of offense that sets the tone with the run and then can hit you in the play action pass game once things start to open up. Well, this team is built, the Seahawks team is built with Russell Wilson and those receivers around a passing attack. And Brian Schottenheimer is an offensive coordinator that wants to build his offense around that passing attack because of the weapons that he has available to him. This creates an identity crisis when Pete Carroll wants the offense to be one thing and the quarterback and the offensive coordinator are looking at him and saying, Coach, I think the offense should go a different direction. This is another symptom of Pete Carroll not being in touch with the locker room. When you have a player coming out and saying, yeah, I don't think we prepared correctly for the Giants and we overlooked this team, and then Pete Carroll is coming out in the same day and saying, no, we didn't look, the guys played hard, we prepared just fine. Pete Carroll needs to figure out why the players didn't think that they prepared correctly for a team like the New York Giants, and you can probably get away with it against an 0-12 Jets team, but you can't get away with it when you get later in the season and play a team like Washington, which has the same record as the New York Giants and is sitting in a very similar position, or when you get later into playoff time and you could overlook parts of certain teams in the playoff games. You overlook their running game because they're a normally passing attack. That's how you get hit and dominated in the run game. Pete Carroll needs to find a way to be on the same page, on the same wavelength with both sides of the ball, his defensive leaders and his offensive leaders, the rest of his coaching staff. No complacency going down the stretch. Shaquille Griffin says that there was some complacency leading into that New York Giants game. That is a sign of bad coaching, a sign of weak coaching. I love Pete Carroll. I love what he's done in Seattle, but it is very difficult to not put some of the blame on Pete Carroll when you hear so many different things coming out of different directions of the Seahawks locker room. All right, what to look for in this game? Jamal Adams. This is the revenge game. This is the game that when Jamal Adams was traded to the Seahawks, I had been looking forward to since the beginning of the year. He said to the media this week that he doesn't hate Gase, he doesn't hate the New York Jets, and he doesn't hate Greg Williams, who, by the way, was just fired, like I mentioned, but really said in the same breath that the Jets did not value him at all. And I don't buy it. I mean, Jamal's going to be nice in the media to Gase and to the Jets because he wants to maintain his image, and he's in a very visible league. But I think on the inside, Jamal Adams is just dying, and he's been talking crap on the Jets. He's been throwing shade on the Jets the whole year in just small comments about how the Seahawks win and the Jets don't, and how the Seahawks are a good franchise and the Jets are a bad franchise. This is going to be really fun to watch. The energy that Jamal Adams had in week 1 against the Falcons, expect it to be doubled. If Jamal Adams gets a strip sack or gets a sack at all, or a big tackle for loss or a big hit, watch the celebrations. He's going to mock the Jets sideline. Hopefully he won't pick up any penalties in his celebrations, but Jamal Adams will certainly be enjoying himself out there. It is going to be a classic revenge game for Jamal Adams. He's going to treat it like a Super Bowl. He's going to treat it like one of the biggest games of his life because of the chip on his shoulder that he got from all of the bad times and bad memories that he has of being in New York. And it sounds weird putting Super Bowl and the Jets, the 2020 Jets, in the same sentence, but if you think of it in this context, Jamal Adams is certainly going to treat this game as a really, really important one because of how much he hates his former teammates and how much he hates that franchise that he essentially escaped at the beginning of the year in terms for greener pastures. Let's talk about the defense as a whole outside of Jamal Adams. The key has got to be stopping the run. This is the second straight week where you're facing a quarterback that isn't a top 5 or top 10 quarterback in the league. It's not a quarterback that's going to beat you with his arm. Sam Darnold is a more talented quarterback than Colt McCoy is. I think the Jets also have a worse offensive line than Colt McCoy had in front of him, but Darnold is not going to beat you with his arm. Stopping the run has to be the key. I said it going into the New York Giants game. The only way that the Giants are able to keep pace with that Seahawks offense is if they were able to run all over that Seahawks run defense. This was the run defense that was third going into that New York Giants game, the third best run defense heading into that game. Certainly dropped down the pecking order a little bit after that game. Definitely need a bounce back week in the running game. The Jets do not have Le'Veon Bell anymore. They don't have a star running back anymore. The Seahawks front seven should be able to stop that Jets running attack. And then if you're able to dominate the line of scrimmage and stop the run, you can start forcing turnovers out of this Jets offense that is very susceptible to fumbling and especially interceptions when Darnold is forced to throw the ball downfield. On the other side of the ball, offensively, everybody's kind of waiting for a Russell rebound. It's been a few weeks now since we've seen the Russell Wilson that we talked about at the beginning of the year as being a possible MVP leader. Well, he was the MVP leader at the midway point in the season. The Russell Wilson that we've seen for the last few weeks is a long shot from the one that we saw at the pilot of the season, the first few weeks. Everyone expects that it to happen. Everybody expects that Russell Wilson is going to eventually bounce back from this. He's just too good of a player to be let down and kept down for multiple weeks at a time. You can beat the Jets defense in the run or in the pass. Like I said, there's a reason that they are sitting at 0-12. The Seahawks need to use both, and they need Russell Wilson to be sharp in the passing game going forward. For this game, you can be in cruise control. I still don't want to see complacency creep into the Seahawks locker room, but they can probably get away with it. The running backs are healthy. Chris Carson's healthy. Carlos Hyde is healthy. Those guys set the tone, establish the run, will open up all kinds of opportunities for Russell to have a rebound game with some good numbers and put up a few touchdowns and several hundred yards against the Jets. The Seahawks need to use both the run and the pass effectively to get the offense back on track. Brandon Shell, the right tackle, practiced this week. The line is starting to get healthier. The Seahawks did have to start their fourth string offensive lineman right tackle last week against the Jets, who got killed, absolutely killed. Two main groups need to improve in this week against the Jets that really struggled last week. And first is that O-line that is getting healthier. We're not sure if Brandon Shell will play in that game, but they need to keep things moving. They need to keep Russell Wilson clean in that pocket for at least a few seconds. And the second part of that equation is Brian Schottenheimer. Like I said on the last episode of Around the Sound, this is going to become my mantra for Brian Schottenheimer. Call plays for the offensive line you have, not the offensive line you want. Make the correct play calls. He did come out in the media and was critical of himself. He said that he was looking for downfield passes too much in that game, which is what I said on Wednesday. So I don't mean to say I told you so, but I kind of told you so. Brian Schottenheimer, it's time to actually improve. You've been critical of yourself. Give Russell Wilson a better chance. Give that offensive line a better chance. And your receivers, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, will thank you with their big numbers. 0 for 4 on fourth downs in the last 2 weeks. 0 for 2 against the Eagles, 0 for 2 against the Giants. Those are 4 turnovers on fourth downs. First off, don't get there. I mean, you're playing the New York Jets. You shouldn't get into fourth down scenarios where you will be forced to go for it, especially late into this football game. But second off, what I mean by saying bringing up the 0 for 4 on fourth downs is when you get to crucial third downs, when you get in the red zone, get to important downs and important plays, Brian Schottenheimer needs to lean on the right part of his personnel. He has plenty of options, plenty of talent between Russell Wilson, between Carlos Hyde and Chris Carson at running back, between his very talented receivers in Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. 0 for 4 on fourth downs, even if it's a third down, calling the right plays on important downs is going to be important in shoving this Jets team into the ground and keeping the ball in the hands of the Seahawks offense. Empty possessions, especially inside opponents' territory that we've seen in the last few weeks. Good play calls will keep points coming onto the board each and every offensive possession. It's going to be really important for the Seahawks to get it done on third and fourth down if they want to get the offense back on track. All right. That game's on Sunday. Let's talk about the Huskies, who no longer have a game. COVID has officially hit the locker room. 2020 has reached the Huskies football program yet again. The game against Oregon this Saturday, the highly anticipated game that determined the Pac-12 North was declared a no contest. And the Huskies do win the Pac-12 North due to winning percentage. Oregon has taken 2 losses already this year, and I do have to feel for Oregon. A chance to play Washington, who was the winner or was leading the Pac-12 North before this game was canceled, and go to the Pac-12 championship against USC. That was stripped from them. That was taken away because it wasn't even them who had COVID in their locker rooms. It was the Huskies. And I'm sure the Huskies followed all the protocols, did all the right things. It's part of 2020. It's really unfortunate. I do have to feel for Oregon for not getting a chance to show their might against the best of the Pac-12 North among them for a chance to compete in the Pac-12 title game. Most likely the Huskies will line up next Friday against UFC if the team can even be cleared by then for the Pac-12 championship. It's an unfortunate symptom of 2020 that there's so much COVID in the UW locker room that we've heard about that they might not even be ready for that game. And there's also a chance that all Pac-12 North teams will miss out on the Pac-12 championship game. There were some weird Pac-12 rules going into the season that if 4 or less games were played between all of the remaining teams in the conference, it would go to simply winning record and winning percentage. And if that's the case, both teams that would play in the Pac-12 championship would be out of the South. It would be 4-0 USC against 3-0 Colorado. We'll have to sit, wait, and see. Everything with the Pac-12, everything with the rest of the year for the Huskies football program is completely thrown up into the air. It's a sitting and waiting game now for all of the Huskies players that are sitting home. Well, not home, but sitting in their quarantine bubble with COVID. All of the Husky fans sitting at home. No idea if there will be a Husky football game later this week. No idea if the Apple Cup will be played this year. No idea if the football season will even continue for the Huskies going forward. They could still opt out of a bowl game if they wanted to. We've seen several college teams do that already this year. Part of 2020. It's an unfortunate symptom, but it's what we are living with for college football. All right. We got through the Sounders, got through the Seahawks. Unfortunately, had to talk about the Huskies, who COVID hit. Unfortunately, did not have a game that we could preview or review this weekend. But big news, Sounders tonight at 5:30 kick for Pacific time, 8:30 kickoff on the East Coast, Eastern Standard Time. MLS Cup, Seattle Sounders versus the Columbus Crew. We'll be back next Wednesday on Around the Sound to cover it. We'll review the Seahawks game against the Jets and go forward looking at the Washington football team, who the Seahawks play next Sunday. We'll be back, of course, new episodes of Around the Sound every Wednesday and Saturday. Stay tuned, and thanks for listening.